like, I haven't been fishing in 2 months. And I'm like, oh my gosh, watch out, fishies, you know.
Yeah, that, I looked at the agenda, and I was gonna go for it.
The daily list. The daily list.
Okay, so we are,
I did one thing.
Oh, yeah.
ladies and gentlemen, we are on camera.
Oh, we're on camera. So, we're 6 o'clock, so we're almost 6 o'clock.
This clock
Close
is
enough.
not
Okay. All right, so,
Gavel is it?
well, yeah, here we go. I will, call to order the regular meeting of the Historic Preservation Commission for Wednesday, October 2nd at 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. See, I told you. So, call to order. It looks like we have a quorum here, so we will continue. And I'd just like to do some introductions. I'm Lizette Casey, the chair of the Historic Preservation Commission. And we can work our way down.
I'm Bobby Jackson.
I'm Doug Edmondson.
And Nichols?
And Joy Porter.
Nick Fodor.
Michelle Anthony, senior planner.
Aaron Schultz, project coordinator.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is approval of the minutes. The minutes were not sent in the packets. They were available online, and I think many of us did not have the chance to peruse them. So I'm going to make a recommendation that we postpone approval of the minutes, and I just need people to make a motion.
I'll make a motion to postpone the approval of the September minutes, for the next meeting.
I'll second that motion.
Just give me a minute here. All right, approved? Aye. Great. With, Glenn, say you're abstaining because you were not here. So-
Doesn't make any difference,
Okay,
it's
all right.
postponing, it's
It's postponing.
to postpone it, yeah.
Oh, okay, right, all right. And then, at this point, typically, we talk about notice of council action. There was none. So we will continue with unfinished business, as there was none. We will move to new business, and there is none. And so we will move to other business, of which we have item 2, discussion and recommendation to the city council regarding revisions to chapter 17.04, historic preservation regulations, which we've all had a chance to look at.
So this has been discussed a couple of times, and at the last meeting, there were some recommended amendments, which staff went back and the city attorney updated the proposed ordinance and has provided the draft that you have in your packet. I noted in the staff memo that the draft in the packet doesn't have every previous amendment lined out in a different color. In here, it really is focusing on the changes that were made between the last meeting and this one. And really those had to do primarily with the undesignated category and the discussion around that. Just some minor amendments, undesignated resources defined in the definitions on page 6. It means it's not been designated as a contributing or non-contributing resource. We did, based on some of the discussion at the meeting, there was a request that the visible from a public right-of-way be defined. You know, is that any right-of-way, streets or alley, what is it? So we did,
An active roadway.
well, yeah, we did put from an improved public street, alley, sidewalk, path, or walkway. And that way, if something isn't developed, we're not going to, even though it could be, years from now, we're not gonna hold somebody to what may happen 20 years later as far as being visible. So, I thought that was actually a good, and that really is how we've, over the years, applied that. So I thought that was a good update and clarification. And other than that, I think that's primarily changes that were included, I'm just going through the pages to see if, there was anything else highlighted. I think that is, I think that's pretty much it. So the memo reviews the, changes that were made previously, and then we have these just final remaining changes that you have tonight. Unless there's, some substantial changes that can, new ones that wanna be made, then I would think that what happens tonight, and would hope that we get to a point where the commission makes a recommendation for, the city council regarding the proposed ordinance revisions.
Public comment at this point?
Sure.
If you, would come to the podium, state your name, address, prior to speaking.
Hi, my name is Paul Bliss, and I live at 3B Loma on the east side of town. I am not in a historic preservation district, so I have no direct property dog in this fight, but I am a member of a group of citizens who we informally call ourselves a historic preservation community engagement. To take a look at these, at the regulations and ordinances and how they've been applied by the city. And about a year ago, actually last December, I sent a letter to the city outlining some concerns that I had based on the ordinances as they were currently drafted. And thank you very much, Michelle and the commission, for making sure that we've been included in these changes as they come along. I missed the first meeting, but I'm pleased to be able to be here for the second one. And I had a number of comments and questions that I'd like to address, starting with actually Michelle's letter of September 27th, 2019, which accompanied the materials. And then towards the bottom, there is a reference to page 8, and it says designate resources that have not been surveyed or otherwise designated will be considered contributing unless designated as non-contributing through the process now laid out in the code. I could not find that language on page 8 or anywhere else, but it seems like, at least your interpretation, Michelle, and maybe the commission, assumes that there's a presumption that unless a property is designated as non-contributing, it will be considered contributing. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, not under the current code.
Yeah, it says any resource not specifically designated as contributing or non-contributing shall be deemed a undesignated resource.
And
Okay.
the memo doesn't, look at the first page 8 on the front. That seems to be a carryover from what we.
Well, as I noted, these aren't in the current draft. These are the things that we discussed at the last meeting.
Okay.
And then there were things that were changed.
Okay.
So this was just a recap of what was discussed previously.
I see. So this comment doesn't relate to the ordinance as currently
Right.
proposed. All right. Thank you for that clarification. The overarching concern that our group, I think, shares is that the decisions of whether a property is going to be considered an improvement to a property is going to be considered a contributing or non-contributing resource is done on what seems to us to be essentially an ad hoc basis. It is done on a property by property basis, and I understand that under the new ordinance, proposed ordinance, there's a new designation of undesignated, so that properties that haven't already been identified as contributing or non-contributing fall into that category. And my concern is that the way this is structured, the way that a property will then be determined to be contributing is at the property owner's request. They'll make a request to the planning department to take a look at the property, determine whether or not it should be contributing or non-contributing. That seems to me at odds with the historic districts as they were originally structured in the city and is at odds with at least the ordinance as it exists to today, which requires a survey of properties. And I know that when we met with the city representatives previously, there was some discussion of whether or not we could put our hands on the original surveys that were conducted by the state authorities. I think actually sent a paid person down to take a look at like 1,100 properties, and she made the decision whether or not they should be contributing or non-contributing. I don't know if any headway has been made on that or not, because one of the things that I think ought to be considered by the commission and by the city council is that a survey be made of the properties. I understand that can be a time-consuming, perhaps somewhat costly process. At our previous meeting, we also discussed the possibility of applying for a grant to allow that to be done. And the reason that is important, in my view, and I think this is shared by the members of our group, is that it will allow some consistency in decision making. If we look back at the original designation documents for the city of Manitou Springs, there was an identification of very specific properties as falling within particular groups, log cabins, bungalows, those sorts of things that our city has. And one of the things that we'd like to get away from and move in this direction is have a single survey where people can go out and say, at the same time, look at all these properties and say, what really matters to us historically and what doesn't matter to us historically. And right now, as far as I can determine, the city is to a considerable extent using kind of a 50-year rule. If it's over 50 years old, that kind of makes it historic. And that isn't part of the guidelines, it's not part of the original designations, and we'd like to see a move away from that. And I think a survey of properties winds up being the easiest way to do that. The second primary point that I have to make is who has the burden of establishing, of determining that a property is contributing. If I am a homeowner in the historic district and the planning department makes a determination based on these new ordinances and looking at the factors that are listed there, that a property ought to be considered contributing, is it their burden to establish that it's contributing, or is it my burden as a homeowner to prove that it ought to be considered non-contributing? That's a somewhat fine point that lawyers like to talk about, but it changes the calculus in how you come to your decisions. Because if the city has the burden, they need to be able to establish by some kind of burden of evidence that the property falls within the categories that are listed in the ordinance. I'd like some consideration to be given to that, and frankly, I think that is something that ought to be written into the ordinance itself, just as a matter of due process here. Michelle, you had raised an issue earlier. This is actually on page 9 of the ordinances, under .050A, and the change language, it says no alteration visible from an improved public street alley, and it goes on. Is the word improved intended to apply to each of those categories that fall?
Yes.
Okay, all right. There's just so many social paths in Manitou that it creates kind of this web of viewable areas that as long as that applies to everything, then I think we're fine with that. I've been asked to suggest to the commission that this ought to be subjected to a public engagement process. The public should be advised of this. We have a lot of homeowners in Manitou who are within the historic district, and we think that a lot of them will have something to say about this, about the way it is currently structured. And this is a question for you, Michelle. Have we made any headway on pinning down the original surveys?
There were no original surveys from what I have found.
Okay.
There's a few properties that are listed in the report, but individual surveys back when our district, the National Register District and our district were formed, weren't required. There was a much looser, I guess you could say, or less documented process. So there was a person that came out, they toured the city, they looked at different properties, they noted ones that had, specific merit or might be National Register eligible, but they didn't go and list out every single property and, how it was designated or any history or anything about it like we would now.
All right, so that understanding is different than the understanding that I got from reading the original properties, because it's very specific. We looked at 1,011 properties, and we determined that 752 of them were historically important, and here's why, but there's nothing like that.
I've not ever seen anything, I've seen the report like you have,
Mm-hmm.
and I've never seen anything that had more information,
Okay,
so,
all right. So there is no survey that we're.
not that I know of,
Okay.
no.
All right.
Don't we have though on individual properties, we've had ones come before us where you attach,
Those are surveys that we've done
Right.
since the
Right.
original district was
right,
formed.
but we have like, what, 400 properties?
300 or 400, yeah.
Yeah,
it's
so
not
we do
big.
have those.
A list of
That we-
properties that have actually been reviewed by the
Survey.
HPC.
And actual
authority.
survey forms, yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
All right,
Right.
all right,
Yeah.
well, that's a starting place, I suppose.
sure.
The concern that I have here is that the ordinance I've drafted on page 8, and I'm looking at .041 sub 1, it says inclusion on resource inventory. It says the commission or the city council may undertake a resource inventory. And one of the things that I think ought to be given some very serious consideration is that should be a shall, not a may. Eventually, this should be done in a uniform, organized way so that there is a mechanism for assuring that there is consistency in the decision making, rather than the ad hoc process that we have now, with the exception of the 400 and some properties that have already been surveyed. The problem with individualized determinations is that they lead to unpredictable results. If I, as a homeowner, own property that is considered in this new broad category of undesignated, I really have very little idea what the city planning department is going to have to do with it, how the HPC is going to deal with it, and if I have to take an appeal to the HPC, and if I have to take an appeal to the city council. One of the things that creates security in property is predictability. And the problem right now is that the process is sufficiently unpredictable that it is my understanding through essentially anecdotal evidence that there are a number of architects and construction folks that just won't touch Manitou properties in the historic district. They won't work on them because there's no way to tell what will and what won't be allowed. And the first question that needs to be asked, and it's a relatively binary question, is this a contributing or non-contributing resource? The appeal process is written into the new ordinance, and I don't know how significant the changes are from the original ordinance. I do know that previously there was like a $500 appeal fee to go from, I don't know if it was directly from planning, then to HPC, then to city council. And even if the homeowner won that appeal, that fee was non-refundable. And I think that's been changed, but it's not clear to me. And this is probably built into the internal documents of the city that says, here's how much we're gonna charge for an appeal.
Yeah, an application for appeal from HPC to city council, I do believe that fee was reduced, but that still is a formal review process and a formal application process. This does include an amended, less formal process for if the homeowner doesn't agree with the determination regarding contributing or non-contributing status. go to, HPC in a quicker manner than having to take it to city council and all of the things that are involved with that.
And is there a fee for that step of the?
We haven't set that fee yet. It would be set once this goes to council, they'll review what the fee should be for that.
I see.
Could you point out where that is? I was trying to find that kind of
Yeah.
expedited,
I need to look.
because it's only red lines for these changes, it's kind of.
Page 25.
25,
The appeal.
that's the normal.
Yeah, I think that's the normal appeal
But there
process.
isn't there expedited?
There is an expedited, it was in the last one, and,
And I'm not finding it.
I think it's, yeah, let me look here, cause that was one of the things we discussed the last time.
And if I look at page 25.103A, that looks like the appeal from the planning commission to the HPC. But it is, there doesn't seem to be an informal expedited, process that's built into that, and certainly that's the sort of thing we want.
Well, it's supposed to be on that page 8, or that section on page 8.
Page H. Appeal or amendment of designation, that's the appeal.
Yeah, no, yeah, I'm not seeing that, and it was in the prior version.
It was.
So, and I have not.
So it should go back in, I think.
Yeah.
It sounds like perhaps that was inadvertently omitted
Yeah.
from this draft.
Because it says here, this is the summary of what was talked about previously,
Sure.
is that, provides for an expedited appeal of planning department determination to the Historic Preservation Commission, rather than the more formal process for appealing the commission's decisions to the city council. So it was in here, but
Yeah.
somehow,
But that's.
Let's get it back in. I think it would be appropriate, I would respectfully suggest that something like that ought to be part of this.
oh yeah,
process.
there was no intention to take it out. It was agreed on at the last meeting. For some reason, it just disappeared, so,
That happens.
That's not good.
yeah.
The final point that I wanna, at least this is a question, is what does the appeal process look like? If, and there's language in here that addresses sending it back for further findings by the planning department, and the city council can send it back to HPC or the planning department for further findings, things of that nature. But I have been to an appeal by a homeowner in the HPC, who's actually sitting here right now, of a decision that was made adverse by the city planning department, that was appealed then to the city council. And the mechanism for reversal was astonishing. It was absolutely brutal. The city council had to make two decisions that were basic, that seemed inconsistent, at least to those of us watching. And the city attorney basically had to walk people through, walk the city council through what they had to do. And I think as part of any appeal process, there needs to be an ability by the city council, rather than making these kinds of specific and what seem to be contradictory findings, that they have the ability to say yes or no on a determination of contributing resource, yes or no on whether or not a particular alteration to a contributing resource ought to be allowed, rather than making the kind of, it was amazing to watch. And they got there, but it was brutal, and it was a $500 appeal fee, which was non-refundable. And $500 is a lot of money to take a roll of the dice, knowing that money's not gonna be coming back. So I respectfully suggest to you that issue be laid out in the appeal process, so that it is clear to the city council or to the HPC as an intermediate appeal body how to deal with these appeals, rather than go through that kind of super complicated, kind of bizarre process.
Well, and that, the expedited appeal would be from staff determination to HPC.
All right.
And if there wanted to be further appeal to city council, then that would go into that appeal from the quasi judicial, body to the council. And, that would go into that regular appeal process.
Okay.
It's not something where the intention was that it would go from staff determination to council.
Correct. And I understand the HBC is now going to be sitting essentially as an intermediate appellate body in that process on an expedited basis.
Right. There's a regular process for that as well, but for these, the agreement is that we would develop an expedited process with little or no fee and a quicker turnaround and, kind of less legal requirements, I guess you could say. I mean, there's always gonna be legal requirements, but not quite the same as when you have to take an appeal to council.
All right. And one final issue, and I don't know that there's room for this kind of determination in the ordinance as suggested here. I know that in some cases, and I'm speaking specifically to my brother's property, there was a determination that it was a contributing resource as changed, and I can't remember the exact verbiage that was used, but basically based on what he was proposing to do to the property, it was determined to be contributing as modified, as the property would be modified. Is there any kind of intermediate step left, or is it kind of a binary contributing, non-contributing?
I think he was talking about contributing altered.
Contributing altered.
Yeah, we've taken those out of the code, because we weren't using them, as we had planned to use them, with surveys and that type of thing. So it's contributing, non-contributing, or undesignated.
Okay, but the contributing determination is going to be contributing versus non-contributing. If I'm a property owner and I come to the planning department and I say we need a determination of whether or not this is contributing or non-contributing property, that can be divorced from any proposed modifications to the property.
Yeah,
Fair statement.
exactly.
And that's a purely binary decision, yes, it's contributing, no, it's not contributing.
Right,
Correct, okay.
right, yeah.
Thank you for the clarification.
Sure.
I appreciate your time and attention.
Anybody else wish to?
Yeah, my name is Dave Bowards, and I live at 213 Pilot Ave. I've been a resident of Manitou Springs for 30 years, and I have taken steps years ago to bring my home's aesthetic more into line with historic standards, and I'm happy about that. But I'm a little worried about the subjective process of contributing and non-contributing. My first question is, does that go out for some kind of review to a licensed professional that applies those set of guidelines to the property? And the reason I bring that up is I sort of see the city as having legal exposure here, particularly if we have no one on staff or no one on the commission that has a professional historic preservation practicing license. We apply a set of subjective guidelines or codes in a subjective process that says your property is contributing or non-contributing. That itself is subjective. So my question, I guess, to the commission and maybe the staff is, do we have a protocol in place that sends something out that's being contested for professional review?
Well, this is gonna be a new process as far as following this, this new code section. At this point, we're, I guess, gonna have to see what comes up.
I can weigh in, because I think we have discussed this. Our intent certainly is that when somebody, and a variety of people can ask for an undesignated property to be considered in terms of whether it's contributing or non-contributing, not just the property owner, commission, city council, planning department. But I think our intent is that when that request is made, planning will look at it, and if it is not crystal clear, and we do this on a variety of other issues, like economic hardship and demolition exercise, we go out and hire somebody to do it. And the argument that, or the discussion we had several months ago when this first came up, and when Tim Johnson was part of the discussion, was the original intent was, well, let's go out and survey everything, as you've kind of suggested. She said that she had investigated that a bit and that could cost $100,000. And I think the discussion we had was, well, how often is this actually gonna come up? When we get MCACs in front of us and either there is a survey that's already been done that deems it contributing or non-contributing, or if there isn't, what we've found in probably most cases other than yours is that the property owner and planning agree. They go, yeah, it's not contributing, or they agree, yeah, absolutely contributing. So our argument was, there's probably gonna be a relatively small number that you look at it and go, boy, I'm not sure. And that we have to go out and hire a professional to assess it, and that we might spend $5,000 or $10,000 to do that versus $100,000 to get everything studied, probably 90% of which will never come in front of us. So that was our thinking. Number one, can the city afford $100,000? At the moment, I would say absolutely not. And can we deal with the issue when it comes up? And if planning looks at it and says, boy, this is kind of a tough one, they'll go out and hire a professional. And we do that routinely on other issues. So I think that is our intent. And then clearly, if they make a determination and say to the property owner, we think it's contributing, and the property owner says, I don't think it is, we would probably go hire a professional and get an opinion.
Can we get that into the ordinance as well?
Yeah, that's what I was gonna suggest, is it seems like then that should be some wording.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of sort of operational detail for an ordinance.
That's pretty important operational detail if you're a property owner.
Well, I mean, I think the intent, I mean, you've gotta give planning some consideration that they do have a great deal of expertise. They also know when they don't. And when an issue may be cloudy enough that they need help. And as I said, we have done that in the past fairly routinely on economic hardship issues. We've hired somebody to do the analysis. So, I mean, I guess we could consider whether, I don't know how you even say that. We'd probably have to go back to Jeff and suggest that, I suppose you could put language in that says if planning decides that it's a complicated enough issue, they will hire external resources. And I think we say that in other places, that we will go out and hire resources. I mean, that's certainly an option that we could put in.
Right, but the intent is not to do that right off the bat, just for every single one that might come in.
Yeah, again, I worry that process also sounds subjective, and there's just a whole set of layers of subjective processes here that leaves the city open for some pretty substantial litigation.
Well,
it's challenged.
There is an appeal process. If the homeowner doesn't agree with the staff determination and staff, for some reason, decides, no, we're not gonna, go out to, get a consultant to review this, they can bring it to the commission and the commission can look at it and either decide, no, we agree with the determination, or no, it needs to go, and have a professional look at it.
I think that wording should be added into this revision that shows that there's a
Yeah,
process.
that probably is not,
And I think we
not a big
could
deal as
discuss
far as
our
that
attorney
goes.
about that, yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's certainly our intent, and that's planning.
And then my last question is, you mentioned earlier, I think, that there was a list of 400 contributing properties. I spent some time on the city's website recently looking for that list.
They aren't posted right now.
Is it published somewhere, or is it?
We have been in our office, basically.
Is it
It's
been-
something that we want to get, posted on the website, along with the individual, forms. But it just hasn't been something that's been able to be done yet. We are gonna work on it.
Okay.
And a lot of those 400, I mean, they're not all contributing. A lot of them, when we get the survey form, it says non-contributing.
Yeah, I just think that, for this program to have been as mature as it is. I'm surprised that that's not available. It just seems like, you know, if we're gonna hold our community accountable to adhering to these guidelines, it would be advantageous to residents to know, you know, what's listed on that list of 400, and, you know, can I see how the criteria's been applied by looking at these examples? Like, that's, you know, that's where I look, it's like, okay, you know, if there's somebody doing a modification to a property, is there an example out there we can look at to say, hey, well, here's where it's been applied, and this is where it's been applied effectively. And so I think that's a pretty large, you know, discrepancy to try and get updated so it is available to residents.
Sure, it's just part of the ongoing, trying to add more and more to the city's website and public information.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
I will make one comment. I'm Bob Lewis, I live at 220 Elk Path. And most of you know about the Money Pit problem that we're having. Anyways, I would just like to lend my voice of support for a public engagement process in this whole thing. I mean, there are definitely monetary reasons for having real clear understanding of what kind of property you have. Because when you buy a property, you don't always have time to find out whether it's contributing or not contributing. So to have a very well-defined product, well-defined set of rules and criteria would be very helpful for investors in Manitou. I believe this is one of the reasons that Manitou's properties are very expensive. I mean, they're very geographically limited community, and everybody's talking about how there's no affordable housing. Well, these kind of processes where it's unknown makes it very difficult for anybody to come in and say, well, I want to invest in Manitou. I want to build low-income housing in Manitou or anything like that. So I just think the public engagement process makes a lot of sense. That's it.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Jared Stolzen. I haven't really prepared anything to say. Just moved back to Manitou. Gotta check my I went at 7/20/21 Duplo, I think. I wanna second what Mr. Lewis just said about having a public engagement process. It's been years since I've gone through the planning code, but I'm an architect and I deal with the planning code in Colorado Springs pretty routinely. And there's so many vague and open-ended parts of this code, and I really would love to have the opportunity to go through and address those. And I think that our committee would too. And another thought about the survey. If the city does go to the extent of spending the money and actually doing a full survey of the architecturally contributing versus non-contributing structures, then, as Mr. Wolverton pointed out, every person who makes an application will have a full, if you will, a library or a fully, what's the word? Fully professionally described criteria for their particular neighborhood, if you will. So you can picture going in and wanting to build a new house between two existing Victorian homes, and you can picture being that builder or homeowner and basically having this built-in criteria just simply by looking at the homes on each side and looking at the professional assessment of those homes, and in that way having really obvious guidance, something that goes way beyond our town guidelines with that. Yeah. So anyway, just wanted to make those basic points, thank you.
Good. Any other comments? Public comment? All right. Well, internal, any other thoughts and discussion?
Well, I mean, clearly, the expedited appeal process is disadvantaged, and we need to find that, and I actually couldn't find it in the other version either, so we need to find that and get it inserted back in here. I think the discussion about a little more meat on the bones about what happens when a property, someone requests that a undesignated property be studied as either contributing or non-contributing is probably an appropriate suggestion, and I think it would be good for Michelle to discuss that with Jeff and see how we can put that in there in a way that he thinks is appropriate for an ordinance. So I think those are good suggestions. The public engagement, I guess, I'm not sure how I feel about that, and I'm not sure that's totally our call. I mean,
No, I was
there is a
gonna
committee
suggest,
on
and that really is up to council if they want that. They have not, at this point, when they directed that we undertake this, there was not a direction to undertake a full public engagement or an additional public engagement other than through the regular process. If they wanna do that at this point, then they need to direct that, and that whole process of designing that, I guess you could call it, would occur. So at this point, I think what the commission would do is, or when it gets to the point where we have the final form, because it doesn't sound tonight like we have the final form, then when you would make a recommendation to council, then when it gets taken to council, we would note there has been, some comment regarding that, and then if they wanna do that, that would be up to them.
Because there would be, as an ordinance, there's 2 readings on this anyway, so, yeah, I mean, I think we could point out to them that there's a group of citizens that believe that would be a beneficial step. And they do have a committee that does public engagement, and they kind of carefully pick out which projects they want to subject that to, because it's a little expensive. It's
Can be.
not costless, but, so I do think that's a suggestion that they ought to handle. And they may see the merit in that. So, good suggestion. And actually, all the suggestions I think are valuable and are gonna lead to improvements to what we've got in front of us, so that's good.
So let's see, so it sounds like, and you know, in looking at this, I really think the expedited appeal, as we've been calling it,
Right.
it really is this last sentence basically in, on page 9 at the end of that, designation of resources section. Instead of rendering a decision subject to appeal to the commission, the planning department may provide a report and recommendation and refer the matter directly to the commission for a decision at a public hearing meeting the notice requirements. So it needs to be made more clear in regard to that actually is an expedited appeal and,
Without cost.
yeah, or with minimum or what, yeah, so, that's why we weren't finding it, is because it's pretty, pretty unspecific or, you know, so yeah, we need to, I think, beef up the language there so that it's, more obvious that that's the appeal process for this code, this section of the code.
And then maybe just addressing the request that, and I don't know if this belongs in here, the procedural, steps that would be required for the types of appeal. Does that belong in the ordinance, or is that just something that then?
Well, there are, you know, beyond this expedited appeal, just for this one code section, there are regular appeal processes in the back of the ordinance. So, you know, this was just created for this one, so I think we do need to call that out as the appeal process just for this, and, you know, and when that would kick in, you know, we can update that language so that it's a little more obvious and, you know, provide a little bit better, information for the public as far as that goes. And then the language for the process, in the determination process, regarding, obtaining consultant assistance, we can craft something, I'm sure, to put in there.
This isn't about the code per se. When you have two houses that are Victorian and someone wants to build in the middle of it, like we talked about, does that middle one then have to meet the historic designation?
Well, there wouldn't be any historic designation, but it does need to go for review and follow the guidelines. And there are guidelines for basically new construction.
Okay, so it goes to that, okay.
Yeah.
I was curious, well, thank you. So this has really helped us too, having the discussions and finding
It
out
has, yeah.
the different
We
things,
keep
because
unearthing stuff, and that may happen again, when we did the
so
second.
that
third version.
really helps us.
Yeah, it did.
Well, I'm gonna go ahead and pipe up and say a couple of things. So, as you stated, the 50-year rule of thumb, I agree. I think that's, at this point, when the historic districts were established in the 80s and then again reviewed in the 90s, you're talking about structures that were either built in the late teens or early 20s into now the 1930s. And I do agree that by the time you reach into the 1930s, early 1940s, most structures can definitely not be considered contributing. There may be some, you know, postmodern or contemporary design buildings that could fall underneath that, but I do think that it would maybe be wise to put in basically a date limit. I think it would really help from an administrative standpoint, that if you, instead of just painting the entire neighborhood with one brush, that if you say, okay, our cutoff date is 1929, and anything built out after that date would basically be considered a non-contributing structure. Kind of got to be a little careful, since, you know, we have a beautiful post office that was built in 1941 that is on a National Register of Historic Places, but I think it's going to be easy to add in buildings that are a private residence, non-municipal buildings such as that nature. And also the survey, I definitely think that's a big deal. I think making that information, trying to put that list together and bring that forth. Now, I know that when the historic districts were first established, there were properties that were given the opportunity to quote unquote opt out. And I don't know if that information follows the building as it's sold throughout the years or not. And so it's gonna be really difficult to determine those buildings that were originally opted out to, you know, bring that into the fold now. So, you know, a survey and then a review of those existing structures in those districts would help a lot. But again, like how I stated with the 50-year mark, so on and so forth, painting the entire neighborhood with one brush, when we know there's areas like the Midland District and the Hillside District where the old railroad grade ran through, that there wasn't one building on that railroad grade until after 1949 when they pulled up the tracks. So basically everything that's built along or on that old easement is gonna be probably some modern building that is a non-contributing structure.
And it probably is, and if there's a survey on it, it probably says that.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is some kind of cross-reference, internal check stuff that can take place from an administrative standpoint, you know, that kind of takes the hassle out of it. One thing I do have to say in defense of these ordinances, these codes, is go to the Highlands in Denver and see what it looks like when you have these two beautiful Victorian buildings and somebody came in and scraped the building in between it and put in some ugly contemporary building. See what that does to the integrity of a neighborhood. Or 5 points. So you really need to be careful of what you wish for, because you'll end up living in a mixed neighborhood that has no character at all. So it's very difficult when you have an older building that's been exteriorly modified to a certain degree out of convenience. I was just looking at 846 Prospect. It's a building that's right down the street from other houses that I've personally restored, and it's a magnificent old cottage that during the 1950s somebody put asbestos siding on it, and it's really difficult to say what the condition of the building is underneath that, but I would probably bet my bottom dollar that 90% of what is either lap siding or old shakes is still underneath it, and they just covered it up because it was easier to do that than it was to repaint the house. So, if you're gonna buy an old house in a historic district, then you need to weather the storm as far as what it takes to deal with it. You can put all the stucco and vinyl siding on the side of the building that doesn't update the mechanical or the plumbing or the structure of the building itself. You're still buying an old house. So, that's part of the MO of buying an old building. So, and that's why we have an HVC. And one other thing, is I heard it mentioned that contractors are leery of coming to Manitou and doing business. Well, try the old North End, where their historic preservation codes are even stricter. And the old North End, when you're doing a remodel in that area, you're starting at least 6 figures. So it's not on the cheap side.
So we do have some mention in some of our documents about period of significance, and that's, I think it goes up through World War II is what my memory is, and that may be a guideline that we want to go with, basically, you know, looking at that type of information and using that type of thing for kind of when the majority of development happened in town. And so, you know, those are things that we can certainly look at and have touched on already in some of our different plans.
Sounds like we have a direction.
Alright.
Okay.
See this once again?
See it once again, so yeah, I don't know that you need to take any formal action to postpone. I'll get with the city attorney, I've heard what you all have said, and we'll see if we can, update some language, maybe beef some sections up, in regard to the expedited appeal and then the process for, referring, you know, how it gets referred out to a consultant. And then, yeah, we'll bring it back, it should be at the next meeting, that shouldn't be a problem.
Alright, thank you. Great, well, it is 7:50 and I will adjourn this meeting.
Is the camera still on?
Yes,
Is it still on?
yes.
Did you turn it off? Is it off now? Well, no,